Hello guys, it's me, Thomas Fan SQB, and welcome back to another video. I know it's been a very long time since I made content, but I couldn't miss out on making a video for Thomas's 80th anniversary this year. Yes, I know it's several months past us by the time I'm making this, but it's still 2025, so I guess this still counts as an 80th anniversary video? But anyway, why am I doing this topic specifically? Well, back in late April or early May, I was drawn to a very popular video of mine from over 7 years ago titled The Evolution of Thomas the Tank Engine. And I thought to myself, hey, why don't I remake it? It'd be perfect for the anniversary and the new essay direction I'm going into with this channel. So that's what led to the creation of this video. In this video, we'll be looking at how Thomas's design has evolved over the years, from the Railway series to now. If you don't know much about Thomas, that's okay, because I will give historical context in each section. There is one major ground rule though. I will only be talking about Thomas's major appearances in the franchise. So no 1970s Andrew Lloyd Webber cartoon, no PR Wickham models, no merchandise, or any other miscellaneous topics. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the design evolution of Thomas the Tank Engine, starting at the very beginning. Before we look at Thomas's first public appearance, let's first look at how Thomas came to be. In 1942, the Reverend Wilbert Awdry made a wooden toy of an 060 tank engine for his son Christopher to play with, which he named Thomas. This design is very different from the Thomas we know today. He has teal paintwork with yellow lining and sloped tanks that extend to the end of his boiler. It very much looks like a simple wooden toy for a child to play with. This design later influenced Awdry's sketches, which he gave to the illustrator as reference for the Thomas the Tank Engine book illustrations. Additionally, Awdry added buffers, splashers, and other accessories to make Thomas look more detailed. Still, he looks very different from the Thomas we know today. It is worth mentioning that this design looks very similar to the real-life LNER J50 class, but it is unlikely Awdry took influence from that engine when making these sketches. In Thomas's titular debut, the illustrator, Reginald Payne, took major creative liberties with his design. Instead of basing Thomas on Awdry's design, Payne instead based Thomas on a real-life locomotive, specifically the E2 class tank engine of the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway. When comparing the two side by side, it's easy to notice which distinct E2 features made it onto Thomas, particularly the extended side tanks, a sloped support between the running board and boiler, and the dipped running board at each end. Payne makes Thomas stand out from the E2s though, by including splashers, a whistle, and only having the dip in the front part of the running board. The design is overall simpler and not super detailed too, making it easier to draw over and over again. Payne also establishes the livery that would define Thomas and all of his friends, making him bright blue with red lining around his tanks, boilers, splashers, and bunker, and also giving him a gold whistle, gold lining around the front cab windows, and a red running board with gray on top. So right from the start, Thomas's iconic look is established. One important thing to note about Payne is that he was inconsistent with certain design features on Thomas. Sometimes he was long, other times he was short, sometimes he had 2 cab windows on his side, other times he had 1, sometimes the lining on his tanks would connect to the lining on his cab, and other times, the front of his running board dipped at a sharp angle instead of sloping down like a slide. Despite these inconsistencies, though, Thomas still looked like something from the real world, an aspect of the books that would continue for years to come. Unfortunately, Payne couldn't illustrate the books anymore due to his mental health declining, so a new illustrator, C. Reginald Dalby, was brought on, starting with the book James the Red Engine. Thomas does appear in one illustration of the book, and as you can see, Dalby's illustration of Thomas isn't the best. It carries over many of Payne's design features while missing others, such as the number 1 on his side tanks and the lining around his splashers. Of course, it was Dalby's first time illustrating for this series, so mistakes were bound to happen. In the next book, Tank Engine Thomas Again, Dalby draws him more consistently, adding in more design features present in some of Payne's illustrations, such as a sharp sloped running board and the sloped boiler support. He's also quite long in some illustrations, which closely matches the E2-esque length Payne drew Thomas in sometimes. By this point, Thomas is established as having 2 cab windows on his side, lined in gold. Payne did draw this in a few illustrations, but it wasn't official until this book. Around 1949, Dalby was asked to redraw and touch up the illustrations of the first 2 Railway Series books, those being The 3 Railway Engines and Thomas the Tank Engine. Although Thomas's core design was kept the same, many details were tweaked to be more consistent. For starters, the dip of the running board isn't as steep. Payne sometimes drew Thomas's dipped running board way too steep, making it look like Thomas's front and back buffers were at radically different heights and not aligned. This bothered author Reverend Wilbert Awdry. Dalby carried over this oddity in Tank Engine Thomas Again to an extent before fixing it in these touch-ups, likely because of a request from Awdry. In addition, the boiler support became rectangular. It generally used to be sloped, apart from a few illustrations, but the rectangular support was chosen to be the standard going forward. Dalby also gave Thomas lamps in more illustrations, most commonly on his rightmost lamppost, a feature that would stick with Thomas in the TV show, which we'll get to later. In future Railway Series installments, Dalby kept these revisions on Thomas. He also consistently made him look like a small tank engine, contrasting the E2's large size. Despite consistency, Dalby's train proportions were off at times. It eventually got to the point where Awdry insulted his designs, which led to Dalby's departure from the series. For the 3rd time, the books needed another illustrator. Let's see how they handled Thomas's design. John T. Kenny was brought on as illustrator, starting with the 8 famous engines, bringing a unique style to the book's visuals while staying faithful to the established designs of the characters, such as Thomas. Thomas generally looks very similar to his past interpretations, albeit with some tweaks. His running board is now black instead of gray. The font on his number 1 is sharper on top instead of flat on top, and his face looks slightly more realistic, since Thomas now has a pointier nose instead of a rounder nose. The center of his wheels is also blue instead of silver. Generally, Kenny drew Thomas much more consistently than Dalby did, especially proportionally, which made Awdry like Kenny's work more than Dalby's. However, Awdry was still bothered by that front dip in the running board. Although Kenny reduced the dip further, Audrey still felt like the buffers didn't align properly. This is where the story Thomas Comes to Breakfast comes into play, where Thomas crashes into a station master's house during breakfast time, leading to the front of the running board getting badly bent. Audrey used this as an excuse to flatten his running board, removing any slope. This development is shown in the final illustration of the book Branchline Engines. Unfortunately, Kenny had to stop illustrating due to health issues, so 2 new illustrators were brought on, a couple by the names of Gunvor and Peter Edwards. In their first book, Stepney the Bluebell Engine, the couple stayed true to Kenny's more realistic style, and Thomas doesn't really change much at all from what Kenny drew. The Edwards even kept his flat running board, showing continuity. By this time, Thomas didn't appear as much in the books, since Audrey wanted to focus on other characters he found more interesting. However, he did heavily appear in Wilbert's final book, Tramway Engines, where his design evolved to the Edwards style they had established as they kept illustrating the series. Thomas now looks a lot more realistic, looking much more like his real-life basis, the E2, and his face has more realistic proportions, shrinking down to the size of a smokebox door. The most realistic Thomas has ever looked to date. After this book, the Railway series would end, until Wilbert's son Christopher took over in the early 1980s, which meant that a new illustrator was needed. Let's see how they handled Thomas and his friends. Clive Spong took on illustrating the books that Christopher wrote, starting with really useful engines, and started by drawing the characters in a more Dalby-esque style with very weird proportions at times. Thomas is no exception. He still looks the same but has more Dalby-esque features, such as a dipped running board and a rounder nose. His boiler was also drawn very large at times, which can look off in some illustrations. Of course, it was Spong's first time illustrating for the series, so he was bound to make some mistakes. After this entry, Spong began drawing the characters with more realistic proportions, similar to Kenny and the Edwards, and also updated the faces to match said realism. Thomas is one of those characters since he appeared more frequently during this time. He returned to the flat running board and pointy nose on his face. Sometimes his face looked too realistic to the point where it was uncanny, but Spong later fixed the uncanny valley feel as he kept illustrating. Although Thomas was not drawn as realistically as the Edwards drew him, Spong still made sure to make Thomas look like a real-life locomotive, and stayed true to that until the end of the Railway series in 2011. Adaptations of the Railway series have been attempted since the 50s but have found little success. It wasn't until the 1980s that filmmaker Britt Allcroft had luck creating a television adaptation using live-action models. These models were scratch-built in Gauge 1 and ran on large sets for the crew to film. To pitch the show to potential distributors, a test pilot was created based on the Railway series story Down the Mine, which, of course, features a model of Thomas. Thomas's first model takes a lot of inspiration from Dalby's illustrations, since the center of his wheels is silver, the nose on his face is very round, and his overall proportions are short and simple. Speaking of simple, the model itself is a simple build with some missing details. Notably, Thomas is missing his lamp irons and the lining around his cab and splashers. His whistle is completely different from the illustrations too, likely because the original one was more complicated to model. One important aspect of Thomas is his face, which is very expressive in this pilot. From disgusted to surprised to cheeky, Thomas has a wide range of expressions, which is helpful in clearly conveying his emotions to the audience. His eyes also move around, helping to communicate who he talks to. One weird thing about his eyes is that they change shape depending on the set. In scenes with the mines, his eyes look painted on with a shine similar to some of the earlier illustrations. In other scenes, his eyes are just simple black stickers. Since the scenes with the mines were first shot for the pilot, it seems likely that the crew changed it to the black stickers since the painted on eyes do look messy at times. In general, Thomas's first model for the show, although basic, accurately reflected his appearance in the illustrations. Now it's time to look at the final production itself. In the first season, Thomas's overall proportions don't majorly change from the pilot, but there are some refinements and additions. He now has lining around his cap and splashers, and he also gained lamps and lamp irons. Even though the Railway series wasn't consistent with his lamp placement, the TV series always put his lamp on his rightmost lamppost. Thomas also has a new chassis, looking much more realistic than the chassis used in the pilot, as apparent with the wheels and the side rods. A lot of Thomas's face molds from the pilot were reused for the final show, but they were repainted to include more pointy eyebrows, which became a unique feature of Thomas's face for the rest of the show. These repaints also helped to make him more expressive. Thomas would pretty much stay this way in the second season, gaining new faces that fit with his cheeky personality. Once Season 3 entered production, Thomas started changing a little bit. It wasn't with his core design, no, that stayed the same, but instead it was with his face and personality. At this point in the show, Thomas started to become overall nicer, and that is reflected in his happy faces, going from a more cheeky expression to a kinder expression. This is further pushed in Seasons 4 and 5. It's also around this time that Thomas's overall design became much more refined and less messy than Season 1. They even removed his backlining in Season 4. But overall, it's still pretty much the same proportions. This helped establish a distinct look for Thomas and his friends in the TV show, which would be more clearly seen in later productions as the TV show continued to form its own identity. Thomas's first, and currently only, feature film, Thomas and the Magic Railroad, was a major turning point for the franchise. It broadened Thomas's reach even further and established a new identity for the brand. This new identity can be reflected in Thomas himself. He is portrayed as the nicer Thomas that started in Season 3, as evident in part by the kinder happy faces that he expresses frequently throughout the film. In terms of Thomas's core design, it looks a little bit different compared to before, given that the movie used a new model made out of brass instead of plastic like the models before. Certain differences, particularly in terms of thickness, make him look more model-like compared to the plastic model, and the paintwork has a matte finish instead of a glossy finish like the first 5 seasons, further making the characters look more model-like. This design philosophy would continue onwards after the movie, so let's look into that. The show continued with the style set by Magic Railroad, since the characters, like Thomas, have simpler looking styles with matte finishes on the paintwork. Thomas continued to use many of the faces from the previous seasons and the movie, and he was still very expressive and could be a little bit more cheeky. not really much to say about Thomas's Gauge 1 model here. However, this part of the show used another model of Thomas quite a lot, particularly with the Jack in the Pack characters. This model of Thomas was made from brass in Gauge 3.5 and was tested during Season 5. The test didn't produce desirable outcomes, so the models were shelved. Thomas's model would later be used in various music videos, and as you can see, there are some small differences. For instance, his stepladder is red instead of blue, and the center of his wheels is a lot larger and thicker than on the Gauge 1 model. We can see more of the Gauge 3.5 model in Season 6 episodes Jack Jumps In and A Friend in Need, and the chunky proportions of the model can be on full display here, such as his lamps and particularly his face molds, which look very different compared to its Gauge 1 face molds. One detail they did fix in these episodes was the stepladder, which is now blue. In the Jack and the Soto Construction Company miniseries, other details were tweaked to be more consistent with the Gauge 1 model, such as his face molds now closely matching those of the Gauge 1 model, and the front lamp now looking much more detailed, like the Gauge 1 model. He was still chunky in these episodes though, which just goes to show the inconsistencies the crew faced back then when replicating models. In 2003, Hit Entertainment bought Ghislaine, the company that owned Thomas, and softly rebooted the show in Season 8 to appeal to a younger demographic with simpler stories and character personalities. And of course, a lot more Thomas. Design-wise, Thomas is the same, but has become less expressive. He is usually either happy or sad and doesn't usually express anger or discomfort, unlike previous seasons, even in Seasons 6 to 7. But other than that, he pretty much stays the same aside from some minor tweaks later on. However, there was yet another model of Thomas built for this era, specifically to use with the narrow gauge engines. This new model was built in Gauge 3 and is generally more accurate to the Gauge 1 model than the Gauge 3.5 model was. Faces look similar to the faces used on the Gauge 1 model. The back lamp is the same shape as the Gauge 1 model, and his wheels look very similar to the Gauge 1 model, as opposed to looking big and chunky like on the Gauge 3.5 model. There are some differences though. The front lamp and lamp irons are much taller, the lining around his front cab windows is thicker, and his face molds more closely match the newer Gauge 3.5 faces than the Gauge 1 faces used during that period. Generally, this model was more proportionally accurate to the Gauge 1 model than the Gauge 3.5 model, showing the evolving model making skills the crew gained by this point in the show's run. In 2008, Hit Entertainment started transitioning Thomas from live-action models to CGI, with animation provided by Nitrogen Studios. They started this transition in Season 12 by animating the characters' faces and the people. As was the case with all of the engines, Thomas's face got a major overhaul. His eyes became way more pronounced, and his nose became a lot bigger, almost looking like a clown's nose. This made Thomas look younger as a result. The CGI face now allowed for more expressiveness that was previously hard to accomplish with model faces. Thomas can now blink, move his mouth as he speaks, and quickly change from one expression to the next. This season helped prove that Thomas and CGI can work together really well in this hybrid style. But what if the show went full CGI? Starting with 2009's Hero of the Rails, Thomas and his friends went full CGI, a huge leap for the franchise. With the new medium, the show can tell stories in ways previously impossible due to the limitations of live-action model work. Although this was the first time the episodes were produced in full CGI, Thomas had used full CGI before. A CGI model of Thomas was used in Magic Railroad, accurately replicating the proportions of his Gauge 1 model. Another CGI model was used during seasons 8 to 12 in learning segments and some parts of the intro, which was very basic geometrically, while still replicating proportions accurately. And of course, a full CGI test was made by Stardust Pictures in 2008, in which the season 11 episode, Thomas and the Stinky Cheese, was recreated entirely using CGI. Nonetheless, this new endeavor into full CGI for the entire Thomas brand was huge, so let's look into how Thomas was translated into this new medium. Thomas's brass model was primarily used for reference when recreating the model in CGI, as evident by the width of his cab door and the height of his stepladders, though there are some differences in this new CGI model. For instance, his wheels are different. They are smaller and thicker now, given that the wheels in front aren't fully covered by the splashers. Gears have also been added underneath Thomas, something that was impractical to add to live-action models. And last but not least, his face has changed. It has similar proportions to the season 12 face, but the nose has now shrunken down, giving Thomas's face an overall cuter appearance than before. Unfortunately, Thomas's face isn't as expressive in these seasons, since he is usually either happy or sad in these episodes. His face reference sheet also shows how basic each expression is, making each emotion feel the same, unlike in the model seasons or even in season 12. Overall, Thomas's full transition into CGI was a huge step forward, translating the model season look of Thomas and his friends very well, while also adding in some new elements to take advantage of the new medium. But it also led to a bland era, as everything felt formulaic and not as visually expressive as those model seasons. Will they be able to remedy this? Let's find out. In 2012, Mattel acquired the Thomas & Friends brand by buying Hit Entertainment, and completely restructured the production staff of the show. As part of the restructuring, they switched to a different animation studio. Instead of Nitrogen Studios providing animation, Arc Productions would provide animation going forward, starting with season 17 in 2013. Arc Productions started by staying true to Nitrogen Studios' animation style, keeping all of the same character rigs, but also started to add some new things to make it their own. Looking at Thomas, he looks the same, but he's now more expressive than before. They focused on moving his eyebrows and stretching his mouth and eyelids to make this specific facial rig as expressive as can be. Thomas can now be cheeky or very shocked in ways that weren't attempted in seasons 13 to 16. This is further pushed in the later seasons as Arc became more comfortable with working on the show, giving a more cartoony look to their facial expressions. In addition, the style of the show became more realistic since the characters, like Thomas, now have shinier paintworks, and Thomas even got his back lining pack, showing a return to high production quality for the show that stays true to its original vision. However, it was around this point in the show that Thomas started to become even more cartoony in general. The biggest hint would come in the 2017 special Journey Beyond Sodor, where the engine's bodies would start bouncing around to make them feel more lively, reducing some of that realism in the show. Thomas would only continue to go down this path, so let's look into that. This new cartoony style for this series came into full force starting with the Big World Big Adventures movie in 2018. This was not helped by the bright lighting and colors the characters had in that movie. The bouncing had also become way too over the top in certain cases, heavily contrasting the realistic designs and settings of the characters. When this rebrand carried over into the main show, not a lot had really changed. However, starting in season 23, the main cast of characters, including Thomas, got an upgrade so that they better fit in with the very realistic proportions of the new characters. Thomas gained handrails on the side of his cab doors, steps on the front of his side tanks, and lots of rivet detailing along his boiler, cab, and running board. It's fascinating that the team decided to do this, given the very fast-paced cartoony tone the show had at this point. In 2020, the original Thomas show came to an end after season 24. What will Mattel do now with the brand? Let's find out. In October 2020, Mattel announced a complete reboot of the Thomas franchise. Now, the show would become a 2D cartoon to match the cartooniness of other kids' shows at the time. So let's look at what they did to Thomas. Thomas's design is very abstract, with many details caricatured. Overall, he is geometrically basic. His whistles are huge cylinders, his funnel is huge, his cab is long, his lining is thick, his lamps are very thin and circular, and his wheels have no spokes. His face now looks even more childish than ever, for he has a small nose. In addition, he was given blue eyes to match his blue paint, which is a nice touch. And he pretty much stays this way until the end of All Engines Go in 2025. Oh, but we aren't done yet. We still have to talk about the 2019 animation test for the series, which features an even more abstract design of Thomas. He is even more caricatured with simpler lining around his body and only having a completely black boiler. He even has a cylinder for a nose. He does have side rods of some sort though, and the whistle design is the same as the final All Engines Go design. Nonetheless, Thomas had turned into a cartoon character, a complete 180 from the realistic designs of the past. And that brings us to today. And boy, what a wild ride! We've looked at Thomas's initial interpretation in the books, how that translated into the TV show, and how much Thomas's design has evolved within the TV show and beyond. So what should we take away? Well, a common pattern I've noticed while analyzing these designs is that each change correlates with the shifting tone of the franchise. When it started out as realistic, the design was realistic. When the show first aired, it stayed true to that as it was trying to be a faithful adaptation. As the show became more childlike, so did the characters' faces. And as the show became more cartoony, the characters did so as well. It really goes to show how important design choices are in communicating the tone of your product. It was very fun looking at how Thomas has evolved, since he is the main character and has had many changes over the years. I would love to talk about other characters too. Henry and Percy are very interesting to me, and Goran is also a fun contender to discuss, now that we have more clips of his pilot model. I'm also willing to do other franchises too, if there is any interest. So leave a suggestion in the comments, and I may do it in a future installment of Design Evolution. But that probably won't happen for a while. This video took a very long time to make, which I am sorry about. But now, I'm exhausted and want to make videos on other topics. Well, this brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe. More content is on the way, so stay tuned. I actually have another interesting video planned that I want to upload after this, so stick around for that. But until then, this is Thomas Fan SQB, signing off.